Hi friends, Pastor Jesse here at Peckway Evangelical Church in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, where we exist to help you know and follow Jesus. One of the ways that we do that is through our commitment to God's Word, teaching and preaching for application in our lives. You've joined us today as we continue our study in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus' teachings, his direct words in Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7. Today we've made it up to Matthew chapter 5, verses 21 through 32. And in these verses, Jesus speaks about three hot topics, I'm calling them, and he gives some very hard teaching on these hot topics. And even next time that we're together, as we close out Matthew chapter 5, Jesus will he'll give us three hot topics, and some hard teaching on those topics. And even as we move into Matthew chapter 6, as Jesus really gets into the nitty-gritty of how a follower of his lives and what should and what should not fill their lives, right? There will be hard teachings on hot topics. But it's important for us as we go through this week, next week, and the following weeks, it's important for us, it's essential for us that we remember what we spoke about last week. Remember what leads into this, specifically verse number 20 of chapter 5, where Jesus says, I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. Remember what we talked about last week? You can go back and watch that video on our website, pcchurch.online. But what Jesus is calling us to, what Jesus is saying through that statement, verse 20 of chapter 5, what he is calling us to is away from just pursuing good behavior, away from a life of having a list of do's and don'ts, a list of laws of do's and don'ts, and doing the do's and avoiding the don'ts. But he's calling us away from just changing our behavior to allowing him to actually change our hearts, allowing him to work in us actual and authentic, God-defined and God-empowered heart change that cleans not just the outside of the cup, that cleans not just the outside of our lives, but actually changes us and cleans us from the inside out. That will be essential to remember as we move through these hot topics and hard teachings of Jesus, because Jesus is not giving us a checklist of faith, but he is challenging us to actually let our faith change our hearts. Why is that? Again, because ultimately the heart is revealed by our hands. Dallas Willard says it beautifully. He says, actions do not emerge from nothing. Rather, they faithfully reveal what is in our hearts. In other words, as hard as we try to keep good behavior, our sick hearts will eventually be revealed. And so with that in mind, we're better set up to understand what Jesus is speaking to us through these hard teachings on hot topics. The first hot topic that Jesus speaks about is murder. And as we go throughout this study, I'm going to give you some AKAs, also known as, to help us get to the heart of the matter that Jesus has in mind. Jesus says in verse number 21 of chapter 5 of Matthew, he says, you've heard that it was said of people long ago that you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, Rakah, is answerable to court. And anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. Therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to them and then come offer your gift. Settle matters quickly with your adversary who's taking you to court. Do it while you are still together on the way, and your adversary may hand you over to the judge, and the judge may hand you over to the officer, and you may be thrown into prison. Truly I tell you, you will not get out until you have paid the last penny. So Jesus starts, as he does throughout this section, with that term, with that phrase, you have heard it said. In other words, what Jesus is saying through that phrase is he is quoting the Old Testament. Jesus, in calling us in heart change, to seek heart change rather than just behavior change, he at no point is excusing sinful behavior. In no way is he calling us to exclude ourselves from the law of God. In no way is he changing God's word when it comes to murder and now permitting it. But what Jesus is doing is he's calling us to go deeper than that. He wants us not only to not commit premeditated homicide, which we know is murder, but he desires us not to live in unforgiveness, anger, and bitterness that will ultimately lead, or could ultimately lead, to murder. Jesus starts by talking about murder, but we can also define what Jesus is really talking about, the heart of the matter that Jesus is addressing, as forgiveness. Because really, forgiveness is truly the foundation of our faith. If God would not have forgiven us, our faith would not be worth anything. And so Jesus starts by saying, if you, brother or sister, follower of me, if you don't forgive one another, and he begins by talking to brothers and sisters. He begins to talking to Christians, members of his church. He says, if you can't forgive one another, then your faith is not worth much either. All right? If our faiths, if our lives, if our churches are defined by anger, bitterness, and unforgiveness, then that reveals that our heart really hasn't encountered the forgiveness and love of God. Jesus says, if you harbor anger towards a brother or sister, then don't even bother giving me your offering. Don't even bother giving me your worship. Don't even bother making your sacrifice. Jesus wants you to be focused on your relationship even more than you are on your acts of religion, right? And he says, if this is true of your life, it will be evident through your speech. Jesus says, if you say rakah to a brother or a sister, and rakah was an Aramaic term meaning emptiness or nothingness. So he's saying, if your actions through your unforgiveness and your speech through your name calling, if that reveals contempt, what does that reveal about your heart? Does it reveal that you are living for Christ, or are you still living for the things that define this world? Are you still living as a slave to sin rather than a follower of Jesus? We should be changed inside, and out of that change inside of Christ, our attitudes and our propensity to anger should be changed. And that will be shown by our speech, whether or not our speech is godlike or worldlike. And we should not only be quick to forgive and release our anger, but we should be active to forgive and make amends, Jesus says. Jesus says, before you come to worship through giving or sacrifice, I would rather you make amends with your brother or sister. We can think of Hebrews chapter 13, where we read, let us continually offer to God a sacrifice of praise, and do not forget to do good and to share with others. For those are the sacrifices that God is pleased with. Not committing murder, Jesus says, that's a low bar. Right? He says, my bar, the bar for my kingdom and for my followers, is not only not to murder, not to just change your behavior and not live as the world lives, but to actually change your attitude, to not even dive into the attitudes that could lead to murder. Adjust your angry attitudes, Jesus says. Practice wholesome speech, Jesus implores you to. And be active in pursuing forgiveness. To go and forgive, not to wait to forgive. Now, adultery, which is not only what Jesus is calling us to avoid in verse number 27, but Jesus is calling us to avoid the sin that leads to adultery. What is that sin? What's something we're likely familiar with? He's calling us to avoid the sin of lust. Jesus says in verse 27, you have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. For it is far better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. For it is better for you to lose one part of your body than your whole body to be thrown into hell. And I believe there are two principles that Jesus wants us to see here. One, he wants us to know that lust, that adultery, that sexual immorality of all kinds, that lust starts with a look. Right? What Jesus says here is by giving us a look, by speaking about look, is he's not just talking about a glance, a passing glance, but he speaks of a glare and a stare. right? Jesus says that all adultery, that all sexual immorality, he wants us to be forewarned that it starts with a simple look. It starts with a purposeful and lustful look. And then when given rein can lead to any number of places, any number of sexual sins. Another way of stating that is sexual sin does not start with the act of our hand, but it starts with the glare of our eye. And Jesus' course correction is to know that lust, which starts us down the path of all sexual immorality, that lust only stops when you leave. It stops only when you leave at the look. When you flee the scene or situation that is causing you to look lustfully. Jesus, in saying that it's better to gouge out your eye or to cut off your hand, is not calling us to self-mutilation, but he's calling us to self-evaluation. He's calling us to evaluate, what is it? Who is it? What place is it? Where is it that I'm most prone to lust? What is the gateway that keeps leading me down this road of destruction, lust, and sin? Jesus is calling us to not only identify that road, that place, that situation in our lives, but he's calling us to leave that place behind, to flee that situation, to flee that place and not be afraid to take drastic action to do so. Jesus wants us to not only not commit adultery, but he doesn't even want us to flirt with sexual sin by flirting with lust. So know that sexual sin of all kinds, it starts with a look, and it only stops when you leave. And then, and certainly these two are connected, but Jesus then speaks on divorce, saying in verse number 31, it has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of a divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality makes her the victim of adultery, and anyone who marries a divorced woman also commits adultery. Again, here Jesus is teaching on a divorce, but he's teaching all about heart change. Jesus speaks on divorce also in Matthew 19. I invite you to read that passage as well. That's also helpful in understanding Jesus' thoughts on divorce. But people in Moses' day, which is referenced in Matthew chapter 19, in the book of Deuteronomy in chapter 24, verse 1, people in Moses' day, people here in Jesus' day, people, of course, in our day, we all look for an excuse when it comes to sexual sin and divorce. When and where is divorce okay, God? That's always our question of God. But what Jesus wants every generation to know is that he doesn't want us looking for an excuse or an exception when it comes to divorce. That is not the heart posture that he desires of his people when it comes to divorce. Rather, he wants us to approach marriage not looking for loopholes or exceptions, but he wants us to approach marriage from the heart posture and from the position of looking at marriage as a way of honoring God, as a way of reflecting God. My friends, we need to, in our marriages, remember that marriage is meant to reflect our God. As God the Father is one with God the Son, so is a husband to be one with his wife. So we should approach our marriages looking to honor and reflect the oneness and uniqueness of our God. Looking to keep that oneness together and not ways that we can separate it. And we should, as we seek to honor God in his oneness, his dignity, his value, his worth, we should and we will do the same for our spouse. Out of the way that we seek to honor God through our marriages, we will then seek to honor our spouse through our marriage. In every situation, we will want to honor God, and out of that, we will want to honor our spouse. Out of the way that we seek to honor God through our marriages, we will seek to honor our spouse. And we also need to understand that in every situation, even the situation that is permissible, the situation of sexual immorality, we must understand that even in that situation, divorce grieves God. Unfortunately, we live in a sinful and fallen world. And so God gave permission for divorce when in the case of sexual immorality, not as a loophole to be exploited, but as a way of protection. As a way of protection for a spouse, mainly a woman, a female, that has been sinned against in such a grievous way. But even in these cases, again, as the people of reconciliation of God that we are, God grieves when what he has joined together is separated. We are called to let our marriages be governed by the reality that they reflect God. And because they reflect God, they should honor our partner. Marriage is about what God has for two and not just for one of you, right? I want to leave us with three things to remember as we seek the heart change of Jesus and not just the behavior change of do's and don'ts. Remember, number one, that the ultimate reality of these teachings of Jesus, that we as followers, again, we don't just experience behavior change. We're not just in the business of changing behavior, but we're in the business of changing hearts. The religious elite, they say, Jesus says in verse 20, they had good behavior. They had righteous behavior. But we know, as we spoke at length about last week, we know they did not have heart change. They didn't have the evidence in their lives because it boiled over through anger, which led to hatred, which expressed itself through selfish behavior. But ultimately, we know for those religious leaders, it all boiled over in murder, right? They murdered Jesus himself. Their big sin started with a little sin, right? The big sin of murder, which is the given in these passages that we should not do, they started with the little sins. We must and we will, as those experiencing the renewal of Jesus, we will not only see our lives avoiding the big sins, but we will see our lives avoiding the little sins as well. We also must remember that as believers, we are people of reconciliation. As Jesus states elsewhere, as those forgiven much, we too must forgive much. We certainly, as fellow sinners saved by grace, we definitely and should be actively looking to forgive one another, our fellow sinner, both those in the church and those seeking to follow Christ. But we should also be looking to forgive and to reconcile with the world. Our lives should not be about tearing down bridges, but building bridges, right? Our lives should not be about building fences, but tearing down fences that separate us. Our lives should be about restoring relationships whenever possible. And in this life, we should be guided by the reality that God's love, that his reconciliation is the thing that God loves. But separation is a thing that God hates. Right? Our God, we know, does not desire anyone to perish in their sin. He does not desire sinners to remain separated from him. And he does not desire sinners to remain separated from one another. One of the good gifts of our great God is that he has given us the gift of relationship and community, the gift of fellowship and friendship. He's restored our ability to experience intimacy. He wants us to do life together, not alone. So we should be people who are active in pursuing that goal and that desire, that good desire of our God for our lives. We should be people guided by reconciliation and restoration rather than retaliation. Friends, I thank you for joining us today as we looked at Matthew chapter 5, verses 21 through 32. I pray that this helped your understanding of these hard teachings on hot topics of Jesus. We'll continue our study next time as we looked at oaths, love for our neighbor, some more hot topics with some hard teachings of Jesus. But again, amidst it all, it's not about keeping a checklist of do's and don'ts to enter the kingdom of heaven, but it's about experiencing the heart change of the kingdom of heaven. Friends, again, if you have any questions, please email us at peckwaevents, all one word, at gmail.com. Check us out. All of our sermons and messages and teaching resources available at pcchurch.org. Online. We exist to help you know and follow Jesus. If there's a way that we can do that, please let us know.